I'm talking to Dr. Chris Hart, who's the MD of Oventus Medical. Chris, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show.
So, Chris, why don't we start by explaining what was the problem that Oventus has tried to nullify and take away?
Sure. Well, it was a bit of a selfish, evolution of the business. I was trying to help myself initially, but I was one of the millions of patients who suffer from sleep apnea, who, for whatever reason, can't tolerate the continuous positive airway pressure machine, the CPAP, and other therapies like a standard mouthguard wasn't effective enough. So I was actually a dentist, still am a dentist, in fact, developed the technology for myself to try to help myself, but also I had a lot of patients under my care who were struggling with CPAP, couldn't tolerate it, and a standard mouthguard wasn't effective enough. So we developed the OVN Optima around about 6 years ago now.
Okay, so for people who aren't aware of what CPAP is and what the other device was, just explain them so we get an idea of what the lay of the land was until you brought your product to market.
Sure. So, sleep apnea, for the uninitiated, is when people, worse than snoring, stop breathing when they're asleep. It has really significant long-term health care issues associated with it. The CPAP, the airway sort of closes off at night. And what a CPAP does is it uses a mask and a hose and almost like a reverse phase vacuum cleaner to pump air in through the mask to inflate or splint the airways. It's actually very effective therapy. It works for most people that can tolerate it. Unfortunately, the data would indicate that more than half of patients abandon therapy at the end of the first 12 months, and many of them don't start therapy at all. So at the other end of the scale, you had things like surgery, which is quite invasive, and a mouth guard that people can wear to bring the jaw forward to stop the tongue flopping back. So I tried both the CPAP, the face mask, and the mouth guard. CPAP I couldn't tolerate, and the mouth guard, I stopped breathing normally about 50 times an hour. A mouth guard I still stopped breathing 20 times an hour. So out of desperation, I fashioned a mouth guard with some air channels in it that allowed the air to get in below the upper levels of obstruction and flow around my tongue to the back of my throat. And I just continued to sleep that first night. It was almost a dream come true. Several million in R&D and 28 iterations of the device later, we now have what is a very effective and user-friendly device.
So how long have you been going as a going concern, making these products and selling them to people suffering from sleep apnea?
So we had a product in market as early as 2015, late 2015. To be fair, it was nowhere near as refined as the product we have now. The product we have now, and I have one here, is literally, it's 15 grams of 3D printed nylon, and it's this airway that allows the air to flow into the patient's throat, and a little valve which acts as a little pump. It takes the patient's own breathing and turns it into the CPAP, if you like. That was the Optima. This one here is approved with the valve everywhere in the world outside of the US and China. And the Optima, we received FDA clearance in September last year to start selling that into the US market.
And so is this why you are based in America now, because you've got the FDA clearance and you want to develop the market there?
Correct. And because the device itself sort of straddles both the sleep world, the respiratory physician and sleep physician world, and the dental world, my background was in dentistry, as well as corporate dentistry, really networks of clinics. When we looked at the US market, we realised that there was a real siloing of professions, that the sleep groups and the dentists weren't really working together. So using that sort of corporate dental background, developing a clinical business model that allowed the sleep physicians or the sleep facilities to deliver our technology in their own facilities with the assistance of a dentist meant that we very much shortened the patient journey and got the patients in care at the point of care without the risk of patients being lost to follow-up and overcoming some competing economic imperatives. So we actually developed that model. It took us about a year to figure out how to do it. There are 28 different sets of regulations to navigate through in the US. We developed that model by about June, July last year. We started outreach to sleep groups, and we actually had material contracts signed on that clinical business model ahead of approval of Optima. So I'm over here helping the team in the US roll out these mini clinics, which has now actually gone virtual.
Okay. So can you show us what the O2 vent actually looks like?
Sure. Yeah. So it's this little mouth guard. A normal mouth guard would bring the jaw forward, which manages a tongue-based obstruction. The airway can collapse. The blocked nose generates a negative pressure that sucks the airway shut, and the airway can shut off at the soft palate, side walls, tongue, epiglottis. The platform technology is this airway, this integrated airway. It's enclosed, and so when the patient would normally switch to mouth breathing, treatment would fail as a result of a blocked nose or a high level of obstruction. With the airway, the air just continues to funnel straight through. And it's actually reducing collapsibility and increasing efficacy by 20% and the response rate by 40%. The second arm is this little valve here. The valve goes inside the airway. And what the valve does, as well as having a low resistance pathway to breathe in through going below the nose and soft palate and around the tongue, that valve actually opens up to allow the air in, and then it folds back on itself when you breathe out. And that resistance added in as you breathe out leads to a pressure gradient building up in the airway, and that's inflating the airway. So normally what would happen, whether it's CPAP or an oral appliance, as the nose congests through the night, negative pressure builds up, the soft palate or tongue flops back, patient switches to mouth breathing. If it's CPAP, the air rushes out or it's higher pressure and it leaks. And if it's an oral appliance, you lose traction on the jaw. So treatment fails at that point. With this technology, the treatment actually ramps at that point when the patient's most vulnerable. And it's taking an oral appliance and making it as effective as a CPAP for the vast majority of patients.
How big is the market that you're chasing?
So the therapeutic market's around about $4 billion at the moment, and only about 10% of that is oral appliances. The rest is CPAP. There are 3 million patients that have been diagnosed with sleep apnea that are not in therapy at the moment. And that's around about a $2.3 to $2.4 billion opportunity for us. As well as that, only 1 in 5 patients have been diagnosed. So there's 30 million Americans with sleep apnea, of which only 6 million have been diagnosed. 3 million of them have abandoned therapy. So it's a very large market. The oral appliance segment of that market is forecast to grow at roughly twice the rate of the CPAP part of that market as patients look for an alternative therapy. And we believe due to the increased efficacy, our clinical studies have shown it's 50% more effective than a mouth guard and can effectively treat over 80% of patients. So we believe we're very well positioned to profit from that. And with our clinical business model as well being very well received by the sleep community, we think we're really well positioned for the next few years at least.
Okay, so you've actually cracked a deal with a company called VGM in the US. Can you give us a bit of an understanding of A, why you did it, and B, what kind of competitive advantage does the company, give Oventus?
Yeah, so look, we're a device that really needs to be sold in the same workflow and the same clinical setting as the gold standard that is referred to as CPAP. And in doing that, we developed our clinical business model, which allowed us to deliver these devices in a sleep physician setting, in a sleep laboratory, or in a durable medical equipment distributor of CPAP. So in the US, the sleep physician diagnoses the patient and sends them to the DME distributor to trial a CPAP. Under this arrangement with VGM, we are actually now selling the Optima through the same workflow as CPAP across their membership. And they're a member service organisation with over 2,500 members representing 7,000 different shop fronts that sell CPAP. We are a preferred vendor with VGM. We're the only oral appliance company that is selling through VGM to their members. We're the only oral appliance company with efficacy approaching that as CPAP. And we're also the only company that can deliver these devices remotely to the patient using a virtual patient management workflow.
Okay, so what kind of elevation in sales are you hoping for because of this link with VGM? On a 2021 basis?
So what it does is the 3 million patients in the US that are outside of care, they at some point were going through a DME to trial CPAP. So it gives us access to those patients. And it also allows the people that normally sell CPAP, if the patient's struggling, to have a second treatment option. Remember, about half of patients will abandon therapy in the first year. So it really is a function of how quickly we can scale up and roll out through their outlets our virtual lab in lab program. Look, we're forecasting very significant growth in calendar 21. We think it'll take around about 3 to 6 months to start gaining traction. While we're not putting official forecasts out, we think it will be very, very significant growth, particularly in the back end of calendar 21, much more so than we've achieved in any other method. And if you look at the number of patients involved, if you had even half of those sites selling sort of a handful of devices a month, you're looking at 15,000 devices a month if we could achieve that. So it really is a function of how quickly we can get the technology into the clinic's hands.
Chris, one thing we've learned over the last year or so is that some businesses were advantaged by the coronavirus. I'm thinking companies like Woolworths and Coles and online retail businesses. But other businesses, in a sense, were held back. And I think if I was in plastic surgery, I would think that a lot of that kind of operations were put on hold as hospitals were being used for other sources. Was your business held back because of coronavirus, or was it advantaged?
Both. So initially, we were doing physical installations, putting equipment in sites and training staff on site and travelling around and launching facilities. When COVID hit, all of the sleep physicians in the US switched to telehealth, as do the majority of physicians. We very quickly, within 2 weeks, set up a telehealth platform of our own, and we started riding gunshot with the sleep physicians and saying, look, if you have a patient that is not tolerating CPAP or is a candidate on a first pass basis, instead of referring them to the dentist and having the face-to-face consultation, you can schedule them online with one of our educators, and we can actually educate the patient about the technology, determine if they're a candidate or not, and then schedule them with the dentist. Initially, we were scanning patients on site. We've now morphed that, and what attracted VGM and after them a number of other large networks is we developed a home care model where we could virtually conduct the consultation with the patient in their home, and so now the patient doesn't even need to come into the facility. So that's what drove the interest of VGM and is driving the interest of other large groups. So while short term we were shut down to only 3 sites out of 14 or 15 we'd launched, since then we've gone back to 22 sites. COVID's coming back again, and we've launched our home care extension and our virtual lab in lab program. So we're continuing to grow units and launch sites, irrespective of whether we're shut down or not. Very effective workflow, much lower cost, zero capex, nearly zero fixed cost. It really is now the Uber of dental sleep medicine. We're able to treat those patients virtually. So
in many ways, the coronavirus has forced you to think of an alternative marketing and sales strategy that you might not have thought about if it wasn't for that challenge.
Correct. It really put a blowtorch on our systems, and it's decoupled us from physical sites. And I think that decoupling has led to a much greater degree of scalability and a much lower cost base. I think any healthcare operator who at the moment can treat their patients virtually is in a phenomenal position to continue to grow, I think, at a rate of knots. And particularly because we now have a non-CPAP solution for sleep apnea that can be delivered virtually to the patient, anywhere, anytime. I just think we have a very exciting time ahead of us. I think we're really positioned for high growth.
Okay, Chris, thanks for joining us, and good luck with the conquering of America.
Thanks, Peter. My pleasure. Great to see you.